So one of our main interests is, in where the English language has seemingly lost its connection to the material world, both in terms of the grammar itself and the mainstream Western assumptions about language. What kinds of frameworks or practices might re-embody and re-enchant the English language and its related languages. So it's everything we've talked about over the last 4 sessions, more diverse metaphors, curiosity about alternative language systems, especially these untranslatable concepts that demand some cognitive reconfigurations. And then more recently, we've talked about sex and poetry and dreams and divination. A lot about the imagination, to use McGilchrist's metaphor, language that frees us from some of the shackles of the left hemisphere, which is a breakout that requires the imagination, the unfamiliar, because essentially too much familiarity deadens our senses. We need to be bewildered from time to time. It's part of what makes the world alive. Angela Voss and Simon Wilson, they have a really wonderful quote about enchantment in their book, Re-Enchanting the Academy. And they say, to feel enchanted is to step through a hidden portal into another way of seeing, into a new reality where the reasonable, the certain, the measurable, and the predictable give way to the awesome, the wonderful, the delightful, the paradoxical, and the uncertain. And perhaps even the longing of the soul for some other kind of life beyond the exigencies of the everyday. So today, I'd just like to do a little bit more adventuring around these ideas of reanimating and re-embodying language, and talk about a few more examples that really accentuate the materiality of words, their energetic force, the lack of distinction between language and the physical world. And one of my absolute favorite examples of this is semantic satiation. So I suspect we're all familiar with that weird phenomenon where you repeat a word a few times and it completely loses its meaning. The official name for that is semantic satiation. And it first appears in medical literature around the early 1900s as a curious and isolated lapse in meaning. It's explained as the result of excessive stimulation in the semantic network, which causes a sort of dissociation between the, I guess, quite arbitrary sound of a word and the meaning that's ordinarily attached to it. On that note, apparently onomatopoeic words retain their felt meaning for longer than normal words if you repeat them. So it sort of takes longer if you're repeating an onomatopoeic word for that weird thing to happen. And I don't know if I'm just really sensitive, but I even get it when I'm trying to spell a word and I keep getting it wrong. If I get it wrong like 3 or 4 times, it sort of spins me out. Because essentially it's a moment of defamiliarization, and it has some really interesting applications. So it's occasionally used to treat phobias under the principle that, repeated exposure to something generally results in desensitization. I've done it with the word cockroach a few times. Horrible, dreadful phobia of cockroaches. But I've heard about people doing it with the names of, ex-lovers too, and anything that triggers discomfort. Kind of find that word and you close your eyes and say it out loud. Feel your body's reaction, then repeat the word over and over. I'm talking like 3 to 5 minutes, like at least 3 minutes. And it feels like much longer, but stay with it. It's really interesting. Because, when we're afraid of something, we're generally not fearing the thing. We're afraid of the idea of the thing, which is sort of something I realized as I was getting ready to go to a jungle for the first time and was just only thinking about beetles. Obviously, semantic satiation, it's a temporary state. I'm still moderately hysterical when I see a cockroach, but since doing this, it's like the absurdity of the fear is a lot more present when I see one. You can almost put a kind of homeopathic spin on it as well. Like if you're trying to change an undesirable habit, then one way of interrupting that might be to, really binge on that habit for a period of time. Like if you wanted to stop smoking, just go on a smoking binge for 2 weeks, really oversaturate yourself. But it's interesting that this word, that this thing is kind of a children's game, or at least it was always included in my weekends. My friend Leanne and I would, it was like a boot camp. We'd sort of spin around until we couldn't stand up anymore, and then say our own names or the name of the cat, Beavis, until we just felt like our faces were melting. But like proper people use it and talk about it as well. The eco-philosopher Jane Bennett, she calls upon semantic satiation in her very celebrated book, Vibrant Matter. In the introduction, she explains that she's going to turn the figures of life and matter around and around, worrying them until they start to seem strange. In something like the way a common word, when repeated, can become a foreign nonsense sound. Then this is interesting. She says, in the space created by this estrangement, a vital materiality can start to take shape, or rather it can take shape again. For a version of this idea already found expression in our childhood experiences of a world populated by animate things rather than passive objects. So essentially, I strongly encourage you all to take 3 to 5 minutes for this when you get the chance. It's really quite a unique altered state. And there's another topic around words and the body and the material world that I'm kind of excited and ever so slightly nervous to talk about for reasons that I still haven't quite deciphered. But basically, I've been really, really gripped by language since I was a child. For as long as I can remember being able to speak, I've had a stammer. And it's nowhere near as intense as it used to be. And some of you might not have even registered it as a stammer, unless I've actually mentioned it when it's happening and just noticed the sort of excessive hesitations or filler sounds from time to time. But I remember being about 4 years old, and I had this big crimson puffer jacket, which is, or was, called a bubble coat in the north of England. And I could not say the word bubble, like it just wouldn't come out at all. And around the same time, we got a Nintendo with the duck shooting game. I discovered I couldn't say duck either. And your world is quite small, it's quite contained when you're 4. And these words came up pretty much every day, especially in the winter. And they were like mountains or black holes. And then they were joined by more words that began with B or D. And then words beginning with C started to cause problems. Then words beginning with G and J and P and T. And it's an issue with plosives, so sounds where you have to block the airflow for a moment and then release it, especially at the beginning of an utterance. Obviously, I didn't have the concept of plosives at the time, but I more than intuited that these letters had something in common. Like I say, it was the north of England in the 1990s. People didn't take their kids to speech therapists. And instead, I'd switch things around in my mind before I said it. Sort of change the word orders, or look for ways of saying things that avoided any words beginning with B's, D's, C's, G's. So like reading books in a group in school, like actually throughout school, was an absolute nightmare. I remember a class it would have been year 7 or year 8. It was my turn to read, and I started paraphrasing Tom's Midnight Garden, and the teacher's like, "Yeah, we don't do that." But even everyday speech, it felt like an obstacle course, and it still does at times in some ways. I have more tricks for it now, and they're a lot more unconscious. So for example, if you put a subtle M sound before a D, then it kind of helps the airflow. So like, Dad, do we have any dairy milk? Sort of exaggerate. It's funny because doing that exaggerates it, which then makes it worse. But that was very, very helpful a few years ago, because it's sort of the shape of an M and the shape of a D are sort of continuous with one another. Also, just like letting the air out slowly is effective too. And if if that ends up becoming sort of part of your unconscious and just the way that you speak, then it's just sort of the way you speak and isn't really associated with stammering. Like I say, obviously it's way more under control now. And when I'm speaking English, really, I barely think about it. But learning any other languages or even saying foreign words, that mountain trapdoor blockage sort of sensation happens again. Also, it's worth saying that stammering fundamentally has nothing to do with anxiety either. It's some synapse thing that's strongly hereditary. And when I moved to Mexico almost 3 years ago, I started learning Spanish in a context where, I really wanted to be able to speak Spanish. And then for the second time in my life, people were finishing my sentences. And of course, it is different. It is different because the assumption is that I don't know a word. But it was really quite triggering at first, because in my mind, I'd more or less overcome this struggle. It was really framed by like battle metaphors. And until a few years ago, I had absolutely nothing positive to say about stammering. I just quietly resented it. I've also been quite thankful that we're not in that bit of the Middle Ages anymore when people were actually burned alive for stammering. It was seen as a sign of witchcraft and satanic practices. We're really glad we don't do that anymore. But it is still stigmatized. Most of the people we're culturally conditioned to look up to or imitate on TV are these incredibly eloquent speakers. A few years ago, there was this documentary on ITV called School for Stammerers, but it was presented by this woman with this sort of pristinely silky speech. She's narrating these 6 people on this glorious road to fluency. Everyone wants to be able to communicate effectively and be understood, but I do think that the sort of overconfident, sort of super polished communication styles have been valorized just to a point of absurdity. And for me, that was the more difficult aspect of stammering. It wasn't kids taking the piss sometimes. It was more of a self-perception thing. I really felt that I had no voice. And then whatever I did manage to say always felt slightly misrepresentative, because more often than not, it was not the way I wanted to have said that thing. And of course, listening to people with a stammer, or with a very noticeable stammer, it does require more patience. But now, kind of reflecting on my personality patterns and my interests, I think things would have been completely different had I been able to speak fluently, had I felt that I was able to communicate. And actually living in Mexico and speaking Spanish with a pretty persistent stammer, it's given me a whole new appreciation of the fact that communication and eloquence aren't the same thing. And just recently, I've had the sense that stammering often kind of disarms people in social situations. It's kind of this involuntary display of vulnerability. And for a while, I would, when it first sort of came back, I was pretending that I didn't know the words to sort of hide it. But now I don't do that at all anymore. I just say like, perdón, tengo un tartamudeo. I'm not putting that on. I'm not. That's how it is. Sometimes. But even more than that, the thing that's really present to me now is how it's affected my engagement with language, in that words have always been these really embodied presences. It's pretty unavoidable when a quarter of the consonant sounds in your language get stuck in your mouth. When for so long everyday conversations felt like wending through a dense crowd. Good fact about wending. Actually, that's where we get the word went from in English. We used to have 2 fairly synonymous verbs for to go. Go, obviously, and wend. And I am wending somewhere here. So as I've been researching all these, entanglements between language and perception and culture and ecology and indigenous cosmologies, I've been encountering all these different iterations of the idea that words can be sort of formidable physical forces in the world. One of my favorite commentators on the topic is David Abram. His perspective, and I've shared this quote before, but I think it's really important. He says that in indigenous oral cultures, language seems to encourage and augment the participatory life of the senses, while in Western civilization, language seems to deny or deaden that life, promoting a massive distrust of sensorial experiences, while valorizing an abstract realm of ideas. You know, he draws on many different examples of this. So in Navajo, there's a very central understanding of words as persons affecting change in the world. He says, spoken words are real presences here, entities that may be cherished, held tight to my breast, or flung carelessly into the world. Evidence not only of a different way of seeing, but also a way of speaking very different from that to which so many of us are accustomed. Really just a recommendation to read David Abram if you haven't. And then another great author who works at this intersection is Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's really quite brilliant. She's the author of a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is this stunning blend of ecology and indigenous commentaries, linguistics, poetry, and Western science. And she was trained as an ethnobotanist, but much of her life has been about reconnecting with her Potawatomi heritage, Native American people of the Great Lakes region. And her book basically calls for a revolution in our understanding of the sentience of other beings. And she advocates for what she terms grammars of animacy that might re-enchant our dialogues with the natural world. And many of her examples come from what she's learned about the Potawatomi language. She explains that only 30% of English words are verbs, but in Potawatomi, that proportion is 70%, which means that 70% of the words have to be conjugated. And those conjugations change depending on whether what you're speaking about is alive or not. But the category alive is much more extensive in that culture. I believe they only ascribe a lack of animacy to things built by humans. So things like rocks, rivers, bays, that they're all conjugated as living organisms. Obviously plants and animals too. And she says that the language reminds us in every sentence of our kinship with all of the animate world. You know, for most English speakers, a plant is an it, regardless of how much ayahuasca you've drunk or how many times you've smoked bufo. If someone asks you, oh, where's that cactus that everyone talks about? Most people will instinctively say it's over there. And one of the many compelling things about Kimmerer's work is that she's attached to an American institution teaching botany. And in her book, she gives this really nice description of her interview to major in botany. It was at the forestry school in New York. And her advisor asked her, why do you want to major in botany? And she told him, well, I want to learn about why asters and goldenrod look so beautiful together. And the guy was like, yeah, we don't do that here. And also, that's not at all what botanists concern themselves with. Nevertheless, she did complete the program. So she's a PhD and professor of plant ecology, but she says that even with her students, in this educational system, she really tries to be mindful of language, tries to be bilingual between the lexicon of science and the grammar of animacy. And one of the things she does is that she encourages her students to use the pronoun ki to refer to plants. So ki for its relationship to the word kin. And she says that most of the students respond in a similar way when she asks them to try and put this into practice, that it's a really awkward switch, but that it does shift the way that they interact with what they're learning about. So of course, she's not saying we all have to go and study Potawatomi or any other indigenous language, but suggesting that we can take, an active role in shifting our language patterns away from these subtle denominations that reduce the world around us to a stock of resources. By subtle, I mean that they're concealed by how ordinary they are. They're hiding in plain sight. And I feel like that the plant kingdom and the animal kingdoms are really, really noun heavy if you're engaging with its creatures as a scientist. Another eco-philosopher, Michael Marder, writes really well on this, about how in the West we can feel satisfied that we know a sunflower, for example, if we can discover and, well, depending on what field you're in, recite its, kingdom, order, family, subfamily, genus, species. I missed one. These names are meant to capture the essence of a plant by assigning it to an exact place in a dead, albeit highly differentiated system that swallows up the sunflower's singularity and uniqueness. When I first read that quote there, I found the phrase capture the essence a bit overboard. But of course, in most scientific orthodoxies, if you can designate those categories, then that is what that plant is. That is its identity. For Aristotle, the essence of something was the thing that makes that thing what it is. So it's even a table for Aristotle has a table essence. And the sort of etymological roots of this word, that they're more obvious in French and Spanish, where S is a form of to be. I know we have is, which is similar, but God, that word's already losing its meaning for me. Essence. But it's one of those slippery concepts that's troubled philosophers for thousands of years, but that most people don't really question on a day-to-day basis, at least not on a semantic level. The word isn't particularly loaded with connotations. It's a sort of hazy swath of like meaning, inherent nature, true nature, significant feature, aroma. But as ever, I think David Abram is onto something when he talks about how many of us are accustomed to consider the self, our essence, as something incorporeal, which is almost the opposite of that essence by numbers of scientific materialism, but does very much play on that mind-body distinction that we've all been marinating in. And I really tried to reflect on how I use this word, essence, and remember that it's really difficult to evaluate your own language patterns from memory. I ended up searching in my WhatsApp and found that I've only written it on WhatsApp once in the last 6 months. Basically, I'd made this like cheesy tropical house music track, and I sent it to my friend with the proviso that it was composed to a particular specification and that it doesn't capture my essence. So regardless of like what I think my belief systems are, if I'm saying that a song could metaphorically capture my essence, then I'm somewhere in the range of a deeper metaphor that essence is something incorporeal. And then I remember this interview with Jeremy Narby that I listened to about a year ago. I think it was the 10 Laws podcast. And he was talking about an indigenous group based in the Peruvian Amazon called the Piro, whose cosmology suggests that the essence of living organisms is in fact a melody. So I went scouring through a load of notes that I made on icaros last year. Now, I'm not an anthropologist, and I was researching because I was going to write a thesis chapter on it, but I ran out of space, so I'm hoping that some of you guys will be able to fill in some gaps here. But according to Narby, the Piro people, when the Piro people drink ayahuasca, they encounter these entities / essences that reside in plants and animals and other elements of the natural world, and they call them kaiglu beings. I have no idea how that's actually pronounced. But the word kaiglu, it's used to describe these entities, and it means one who generates visions. So that's what they do. These beings generate visions and songs. But he sort of questions, if they generate visions, what do they themselves look like? it seems that they don't have a visual form so much as an oral or sonic form. They're made out of their knowledge, and they are songs. So these are beings, essences made of knowledge and song. And what they have in common with humans is singing. So the shaman, curandero, chief, whatever, listens to the songs of these powerful entities / essences and sings along with them. And through that process is able to see as they do and know as they know. And that's where the transfer of power occurs. You know, that's the process of becoming another. And I loved reading about this because before I sort of started looking into it, I was unknowingly conflating icaros with hymns, you know, kind of nice songs to instill a particular message. And apparently that's not the case at all for most groups. As the anthropologist Stephen Bayer puts it, he says, abstraction from conceptual meaning is a key feature of shamanic music. The more abstract, less conceptual, less overtly intelligible the icaro, the more power it has. Greater power inheres in language refined away from ordinary meanings. Refined away from ordinary meanings. I think this is a really good example of where phrases like plant spirits are just way off the mark. You know, spirit, I think it has very immaterial connotations when it's used in that way for Westerners. And in this case, this composition, so to speak, of the entity is this sonic vibrational pattern, you know, just as we are on a fundamental level and the stuff around us. You know, it's very much a terrestrial encounter or harmony or choir. But Nabi suggests that the dichotomy between humans and these entities, it's not between the material and the immaterial, but between the visible and the invisible. So with this, we arrive at this widespread cosmology, at least in the Amazon, in which there's no divide between a song and a plant or animal or river or whatever. So particular sound patterns are entities. And I can't pretend at all to have deep, authentic understanding of this. I've never been to the Amazon. I've never learned an icaro from a plant or an animal. I've just read some books by anthropologists who have offered their opinions and interpretations. But this sound patterns as entities concept, there's an aspect of this that feels relatable in a very physical way, having entered into such a nuanced and complex relationships with all the different sounds of the English language, you know, having felt like there was actually a power struggle between myself and plosive sounds, these shapes. And obviously we make meaning in whatever ways we can. And of course, the comparison that I'm making says nothing about icaros in sort of indigenous terms. But I think if a comparison can lead to more animistic perspectives and sort of richer encounters with language, and we're not overtly sort of bastardizing anything, then I think it's valuable. The next thing I really want to research when I get the chance is the Mazateks. So Maria Sabina, she's famous for having said, I cure with language. But for now, I'll leave you with the words of Aldous Huxley, who said that to any realistic observer, it's surely obvious that not only do we have no right to treat living beings as things, we have no right to treat even things as things.
Well, thank you so much, Reanne. That was really, really beautifully expressed. And there were so many different engagements with the experiences of hearing and speaking there. And you crafted such a beautiful delineation of your triumph over stammering. And one of the things I loved was this idea of making the conscious unconscious, and your strategies for this were a really, really important thread of the talk for me, because it's so the opposite of the psychoanalytic principle of bringing the unconscious to the surface, and also so contrary to the messaging of so much therapy and psychedelic ideology. And the reverse engineering that you detailed was so valuably is really, really underexplored in wider general culture. And it's also something that I found helpful in my struggles with the production of speech. So I was in my late 20s when I finally went on my neurodiversity journey, and I found that there was actually a named concept for the thing that I'd experienced since I was about 11, and it's called selective mutism, which can be a facet of autism. And it's where you shut down, and you shut down in the sense that you just can't use your physical or vocal apparatus, and wishing you could makes it worse, and this kind of calamitous paralysis sets in. And so, feeling some parallels to what you were describing in your bubble coat, Reanne, what I experienced much of the time in my teenage years was this feeling of wanting to say something and pulling my hair out trying to say it and not being able to, or it not turning out how I'd hoped. And in my case, I wouldn't manage it in time for it to still be relevant to the conversation ever. And what did come out would be a kind of spider on acids rendering of what I'd hoped to say. And if I had managed to say it properly, then everyone would have thought it was a really weird thing to say anyway in its own right. So the net result was that I was super shy, and then I had this gargantuan vocabulary brewing because I was reading all the time because I was so shy. So there was this vicious cycle where, as my timidity and ineptitude for saying words intensified, my inner world was fermenting into something much more lexically complex and even more difficult to craft into anything I could go on to fail to express. So I really want to say that I've been so grateful to all of you in these sessions and in the Semantic Sessions pilot project for the opportunity in this community that has formed to keep trying at this thing called speaking that for many years I never got any better at. That was partly because I never did it. And so it's been really brilliant to have the opportunity to get more familiar with the feeling of discussion. And I've been feeling so excited whenever what I hope to say matches up somewhat more closely than it used to with what I managed to say. And obviously, I've been loving taking constant inspiration from you, Reanne, and from all of you. So thank you. And I'm really interested in all of your personal relationships with speech and its mechanics. And also, there's so many of you here and over the course of the sessions who have more than one language. And so I'm really interested in how those struggles and techniques travel between the languages that you speak. But back to Reanne's talk, I love how onomatopoeic the word essence is. And it reminds me of the Buber and Kiki effect, which Julian Vane was talking about in our divination session, where the letters sound how they look, which looks kind of like wafts of scent moving through the air, and its sibilant sounds like that dispersal. And the Aristotelian idea of essence of a table made me start thinking in very physical terms, and particularly about an experiment called the 21 grams experiment, where a physician called Duncan McDougall weighed people at the point of their death, ultimately determining that the human soul as it leaves the body weighs 21 grams. And this has been scientifically discredited because he only actually had 6 subjects, so it's kind of the median of these 6 souls. But it's had a really great longevity in film and TV and music. And I don't know how important unembodied agencies having a physical weight is, because thinking about what you said about Icaros and their sonic vibrational pattern being very much a terrestrial encounter taking place in this plane, it's clear that there's so much going on in terms of the physics itself, if not the physicality energetically. So I also loved what you said about overconfident communication styles being valorized to the point of absurdity as a really beautiful phrase, but also because I think stammering gets such a bad rep. But energetically speaking, there are ways of talking clearly, like shouting, or, and I definitely find this one much worse, enunciating each word with a really kind of threatening clarity, that precipitate an acute stress response in the hearer's nervous system. And this is a really negative form of energy conduction, which can have really noxious effects throughout the physical body, especially if someone experiences it regularly. And so there are far worse means of making communication impossible than having a well-intentioned stammer. Now, onto the Icaros. Rachel Harris is a psychologist who wrote this really brilliant book called Listening to Ayahuasca. And she has concluded that one of the largest ever studies on the psychospiritual integration of ayahuasca, she conducted one of the largest ever studies on the psychospiritual integration of ayahuasca. And she describes an urban ceremony where the ayahuasca wasn't doing anything. At least it wasn't until a CD with Icaros was put on, and then luckily everyone started tripping balls, which feels very demonstrative of the Jeremy Narby ideas you were discussing, Reanne, about the precipitous intelligences contained within the Icaros. Remembering that the title of this talk is Reanimating Language, I loved what you said about everything in childhood being animate and this being something that gets lost due to social conditioning. And I think it's important to note appreciatively that this session is a much more gentle alternative to some of the other established ways of going about retrieving your childlike conceptual flexibility, like drilling a hole in your skull and reversing the limited perceptual faculties you've left with as it hardens with maturation, which is a core aim of the practice of trepanation. And Joe Mellon's Borehole is a really brilliant key text to read on the scientific theories behind this. And we're also not inducting you today in a practice which was developed by a concerned father turned parapsychologist called Jose Silva in the 1940s to increase his children's IQs. So Silva set out to decondition his children from their schooling, believing that the modern educational training is the enemy of the alpha brain state that best allows for expanded kinds of thinking. And he was so successful that his daughter developed a kind of ESP, and she developed the ability to answer questions before he'd even asked them. And his methods are practiced today in a hugely popular program, which is quite sinisterly called Silva Mind Control. And contrary to what the name suggests, it's actually all about liberating ourselves from conditioning and reaccessing childlike ways of thinking. But why do we need gurus and experiences for this kind of emancipation? Now, Sarah Janes, who came to talk to us about dreaming in an earlier semantric session, did a brilliant talk at Noisily Festival in 2019, addressing the idea that we forget we can use our imaginations as we get older. And so many of us delight in the more flexible thinking that we all discover on psychedelics. But she questioned whether this has a darker flip side culturally, in the sense of cultivating a collective forgetfulness that our imaginative powers are innate and that we could just use them. So often we need permission to step through a portal. And for instance, this could come in the form of knowledge that we've taken a drug. And it would make me so happy if we came up with alternative ways of conceptualizing what we mean by the word portal at some point in this session. But the word itself, though it's overused, has a particular resonance in altered state context, because in the 1800s, medical terminology used the word portal to describe the entry point of a drug going into the body. So you've got your mouth or your syringe puncture, and this physical portal would precipitate access to the following imaginal one. And finally, something which your talk made me consider is English, the English language, particularly unconducive to imaginal thinking? So we tend to be so specific in English because we're not generally using many multiplicities of meaning within any given word. And this is perhaps why we have such a corny fetishization for puns, because we get so overexcited when a word that fits into one context can also go into another. It's something that I find that my friends with English as a second language never find as funny, because there's generally more movement of meaning between words and polyvalence in many of the Romance languages. Now, I'm learning Spanish, and one of the things I keep noticing is the increasing poeticism and conceptual framing between words in Spanish versus English. So in Spanish and Ukrainian as well, a jellyfish is a medusa. And so you've got the invocation of the Greek myth. Whereas in English, it began being called a jellyfish in the 1840s due to their gelatinous structure. And it very much does conjure up this idea of a group of scientists peering over it with lorgnettes going, oh yes, it's a gelatinous, it's a fish. And the science writer Julie Burwald has a really beautiful analysis of all the different cultural connotations behind the terms for jellyfish in different languages. So please excuse my pronunciation, but in Spanish, there's also lágrimas de mar, or sea tears. And then more positively in Portuguese, there's agua de vida, living water. And then there's other cultures where the jellyfish has more femininity ascribed. So there's Farsi, Arudaya Ay, sea bride, and in Turkish, Deniz Anansi, mother of the sea. And then my favorite, in Welsh, it's a Sigod wibbly wobbly, or wiggle wiggle fish. In the spirit of there being many, many words which can have multiplicities of meaning for one thing, and also of there being many different but no right or wrong answers, I think it's time to open up this discussion.